Heavenly Father, thank you for this Sabbath that you've given us. Lord, give us not just rest from our labors, but from our worries, our fears, our doubts, and our concerns. Empower us with a generous portion of wisdom and your Holy Spirit. Cover us with grace as you fill us with your presence, Lord. Lord, we're not worthy of the love that you extend to us, but we know that we're grateful that the Lord has, and our Lord and Savior has provided a way for us to be not just healed from our diseases, but our sins as well, and made us righteous, Lord, not because of our own will and our own abilities and powers, but because of the love of the Lord that has been extended to us because we believe in him. And so, Lord, I ask that you be with us today, that you'll bless everyone that is with us, and that you'll also bless those that cannot be with us for whatever reason, but that you be with us throughout the rest of our study this day, in our sermon as well, and that you help us, Lord, to be able to apply whatever it is that we learn in a meaningful manner. And so we ask this in Christ's name, to whom we give all praise, honor, and glory. Amen.
Okay, so we're going to continue on with the Habakkuk study we've been doing. We're going to finish it this week. And we'll start with a bit of a review of what we've been through, in fact, for both the past weeks that we've done, and kind of wrap it up in this review so we can put the pieces all together in one place. So what we're going to do here is, and I've gone through this before, but I'm going to do a bit of it again, looking at the target audience for this prophecy. Who is this aimed at? And many of the prophecies are just generally aimed at Israel. But this one is targeted towards a specific group of people. And it's targeted toward the people in Israel who think of themselves as righteous. In fact, they think that they are more righteous than any other nation. But they treat God very poorly. And that's really what we see with this questioner in Habakkuk. They think God should be stepping in to stop people from sinning. They think that God is too holy to punish Israel, as the other prophets have been warning Israel about. And so this questioner represents these people who have all of these wrong ideas. And we're going to see, as we go through these questions here, how the questioner shows that he has these bad ideas about his relationship with God. And so the first question that was asked by the questioner, he implies that it's your responsibility, God, to stop people from sinning. You should be stepping in and stopping these people before they do the bad things. And that's a false assumption. We talked about that. So, but then he goes on to say, you haven't been doing that, God. And so he's blaming God. And he says, because you haven't been doing that, people are doing really terrible things now. And the world has gotten horrible. I can't even stand to look at it, he says. And he also says, because you haven't stepped in and stopped these people, the justice and the love that you have always wanted them to show has been perverted, and it doesn't exist anymore. And so he's blaming God for the state of things, because he thinks God should be stepping in to fix things. And so there's a bad idea there, blaming God for things. And so God's first answer to that is not really a direct answer to that. The questioner has asked God to step in and stop these people from doing things. And God says, I'm going to deal with it. I'm raising up a people who are going to destroy Israel. They're going to blow through there like a wind. You won't believe it. You wouldn't believe it if you were told it. And he says they're going to take captives. And by taking captives, what he means by that is they're going to take them off to their homeland where they come from. And that's how wars worked in those days. The people who survived the battle were taken off to the homeland of the conquerors. And so these captives will be taken out of Israel. And so he says, But despite this, these Babylonians are going to be, or Chaldeans, as they're also called in this translation, they will be punished because what they're doing is also wrong. And we're going to see some more of that as we go on here. So that was God's first answer to that first question. And the second question actually gets worse. It begins by the questioner realizing, oh man, this is not good, but we're going to survive it. And then he starts arguing with God. He says, you are too holy to raise up an evil country. How could you possibly do such an evil thing to bring up a country like that? And so again, you're seeing this bad idea towards God. And he says, why would you use an evil country to punish us, a people who are more righteous than them? So again, he's saying God is not just. So we're seeing a lot of bad ideas represented by the questioner here. He says, you're doing an unjust thing by having these evil people punish us. And then he says, if you raise them up, You will just be causing them to keep on conquering, and they'll conquer and keep on doing that until they've conquered everybody. So he's arguing with God here. Again, he sees himself in a position where he's on the same level with God and can somehow have a discourse with God and explain to God how God is doing things that are wrong. So, and he continues by saying, they will keep on worshiping their strength, and then they won't be worshiping you, he says. And so that's the argument that he's putting forward to God. And he finishes up by saying something that's really quite amazing. He says, I will stand in defensive readiness and fire back when God responds. So he's in here to have a fight with God about what's right and wrong. He doesn't think God is doing what's right. And so we're seeing a great boldness there in those questions, and pointing fingers at God, arguing with God, all those sort of things that he's doing. And remember that the questioner represents the people in Israel who are doing exactly the same thing as this. So God's answer to this is, again, not a direct answer. The implication from his answer is, I'm not going to fight with you about whether I am just. I am just whether you like that or not. But he says, I'm telling you, this is going to happen. And you can write it down, you can put it on stone, it's going to happen. And then he finishes off by saying, those people who hear this message can benefit from it. And so we're going to see the rest of that message now as we go through this. And now this is the end of the questioning and answering back and forth. And now God goes on to a big monologue talking about things. And it's important to understand exactly how that monologue is being done. It's being done a little different than other prophecies. In other prophecies, I talked about this before, generally, God would warn the people that they've turned away from him and there's going to be consequences for that. And then in separate prophecies afterwards, you will see him talking about what's going to happen to those people who God uses to attack Israel and punish Israel. And in this prophecy, they're kind of being mixed together, both of those ideas of the evil things that Israel is doing to God and what's going to happen with the Chaldeans and the false ideas that they have. So God is going to be using the Babylonians as a teaching tool here to talk to Israel about what Israel is doing and how they're treating God. Particularly, we see that from the questioner and their attitudes toward God. And so Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4 through 5 is where we're starting. And it says, behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. You've heard that before. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, the arrogant man is what that means, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. So what's happening here is important to understand. God is using that phrase that you've heard many times before, the righteous will live by his faith. And that's a verse that gets quoted in the New Testament quite a few times. If you didn't know where that came from, it came from Habakkuk. So what he's saying is there are two groups of people. There are the truly righteous people of Israel, and there are people who think that they're righteous, but they aren't. And there's the Babylonians. So he's kind of separating into two groups, the Babylonians, and he's going to do this parallel of the Babylonians are a lot like the unrighteous people of Israel, and I'll show you how. And we've kind of seen a little bit of how that bad attitude is in the questioner. And he's separating the other group out, which is the truly righteous people of Israel. And those are the people who live by faith, by the faith of God, is what he says. And so keep your eyes on that, because everything that God is going to be saying about the Babylonians or Chaldeans is true of the unrighteous people of Israel. And there's a large number of them at this point. And so one point here that he makes right away is when the Chaldeans come and attack Israel, it will be the righteous of Israel who will survive. The unrighteous, this is a winnowing, as we see many times in the Bible. This is God separating out the people who are unrighteous for destruction, and the people who are righteous he keeps on. And so this pattern of separating out the people and keeping the good remnant is something we see through the Bible many, many times. And that's what's going to be happening here. And so he says, the unrighteous people, both the Babylonians and the unrighteous people of Israel, have faith in themselves. And this is a defective thing, he says. A person with this pride, this faith in themselves, will not live. And that's going to be the consequences of the Babylonians attacking the unrighteous people of Israel. And he talks about them as being deceived as if by wine. And remember that he talked about the Chaldeans. having this God of strength that they worshiped who is deceiving them. And God's going to talk more about this idea of being deceived by this God of theirs that they've created. So they have this God of strength that they believe that they can conquer everybody. And he says a person like that is deceived as if by wine. And a person like that wanders from his home, wanders from his place where he should be. And his appetite grows, and it becomes more and more, not only for more wine, but for other things. And so he's, in speaking of the Chaldeans, he's saying they came to believe that they were invincible, that they had a God of strength, that they could take out any country that they wanted to, and they're deceived by that. But this is also applying to Israel. They have the same problems, but in a spiritual sense. They are deceived, thinking that their pride has deceived them into thinking that they have an invincible relationship with God, that they can't be punished for the things that they're doing. And therefore they've wandered away from their spiritual home, which is God.
Power went off.
And their appetite for things that are not God. Okay, so an unrighteous person of Israel has these same problems as the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, and their appetites have grown too, not only for more of this spiritual wine that deceives them, but for other things, and they've gone chasing after other gods, and all sorts of things like that are being done in Israel that shouldn't have been done. So I hope you can understand this idea that he's making this parallel between the unrighteous people of Israel and the Babylonians. And he says only the truly righteous people of Israel are the ones who are going to survive this, because that's what God's plan is to do here, is to separate out these two groups. So so he's going to break this down into a bunch of different particular topics. We saw pride mentioned there, and we're going to see 3 other topics mentioned as we go along here. And these are all, remember, things that the unrighteous people of Israel have a problem with, just like the Chaldeans. Well, although with the unrighteous people of Israel, it's more a spiritual thing than a physical thing, but in many cases also a spiritual or also a physical thing. So that saying, the righteous will live by faith, by that he means this isn't going to be a purposeless, random destruction of Israel. Israel is going to survive, but it's going to be the good remnant, or at least mostly a good remnant that is going to survive. And as I said before, this is what's called a winnowing. And winnowing was what you did when you harvested grain. You beat the grain with a stick until the seeds separated away from the chaff, and you kept the seeds and you burned the chaff. And so that's what's happening here. That's what's going to be happening. God doesn't do these destructions for no reason at all, just to be mean. He does it with a purpose in mind, and that's what he's going to be doing here. So, and this phrase, which is in the New Testament many times, is hinting at this new covenant that's coming up and the Messiah that's coming up. So we see here, again, as we saw in the past, subtle references to the coming of the Messiah, to end times, our end times even. And so we see this mentioned in prophecy, little bits and pieces. And we also see in here a reference to Sheol and death. And he talks about Sheol and death being unsatisfied. There's always room for one more person in Sheol. There's always room for another person to die. And so it brings back this idea of the consequences of this Babylonian conquest. There's going to be a mass slaughter of all of those people who are unrighteous Israel. And this huge loss of life is going to happen. And that's part of God's plan here. This is how he's cleaning Israel. He's purifying Israel. So as I said before, he's going to be changing topics, and now he changes the topic to theft. And he says some very interesting things about theft here. So this verse, he also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all peoples. Will not all of those take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuation against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his, for how long, and makes himself rich with loans. So he's talking about the Babylonians, but also at the same time about the unrighteous of Israel, as I've said here. So keep that in mind. So God is using a technique here that we see in other prophetic writings. Voices are used, but they aren't the voices of real people. They're just as if those people would say this thing. And so what he's talking about here is these people that the Babylonians are conquering are going to be how can I say this? They are going to be showing that you can't succeed by doing that. This attempt to conquer people can't ever succeed. And God's going to be talking about that some more about that. So he's talking about this idea that it's really a loan, which is kind of an interesting idea. We'll dig into that a bit more. He says you can't steal such things. And so people speaking in prophecy is just a different way for God to say what he wants to say. And that happens in all sorts of prophets. Revelation, Isaiah, all lots of others do that. And God speaks with the voices of other people. So it doesn't mean that actual people will say these words, but the words are presenting an idea. And so the idea that's being presented here is that you can't succeed with theft. No matter what you do, it's going to be just a matter of time until you have to pay it back like a loan. And so theft never works to your advantage. And the longer you keep up that theft, the more you have to pay back. And so that's that idea of a loan. And we'll see that again here. So what God is saying here is whoever steals, what has been taken for must be paid for. And you can't get away from that. And we're going to see an idea here that the universe is built this way. And God seems to be saying that's just the way things work. And we'll see more of that a little bit later on. So what he's saying is the countries that have been stolen by the Chaldeans and the people that have been taken off into captivity cannot be kept for long. The world just won't allow that. Justice in the world God created won't allow that. And in fact, God says, thinking of stealing as a loan that must be paid back with interest. So the longer you keep them, the more you have to pay back for having stolen them. And that's just the way the world works. We'll see some more references like that. So this takes us back to the point here that this is not going to end well for the Chaldeans. And history supports exactly that. We know what happened to them with the Babylonians being conquered by the Medes and Persians later on. That's recorded in the Bible as well as in history. So the idea that they could go out and swarm out and conquer the whole world and keep them is a wrong idea. Their false god gave them this idea that they could achieve that. But God is saying you can't ever hope to achieve that. It just won't work. And so also, as I've been saying all along here, and we'll say again, remember that this prophecy is to Israel and it's about Israel. Israel has been also stealing from God. They haven't been giving him what's due to him. And God is saying to them the same message. He's saying that you've been stealing from me and you haven't been giving me what's mine, and that there's going to be consequences for that. What has been taken has to be paid for. And that's just the way things are going to work here. So the next verse that we're going to look at here, it continues this idea of talking about theft. And it says, will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them. Because you have looted many nations, all the remainder of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town and all its inhabitants. So here's this idea that I talked about before. God is saying this is just the way things work in the world. And we've seen that in our own lives. Evil people come to disaster because of the things they've done. In fact, some of that's going on in the news right now. And they thought that they could get away with what they were doing, but they couldn't get away with it. And the universe has worked in such a way that people became aware of what they had been doing, and now there's consequences. And that's just the way it works, is what God is saying here. And specifically to the Babylonians, he's saying conquering peoples, and to the Israelites, he's saying, and thieves, real people who steal things, eventually pay for what they have done. It's just that way. It says it may not actually be you who pays for what you've done. It may be that it will be your children or your grandchildren who pay for what you've done. So the theft is going to be paid for by somebody in your line. And he says, and it may be not by the people that you've actually stolen from, but it might be from their children or their grandchildren. So the things that have been done come back on you, is what God says. And that he describes that in the sense of that's just the way things work in the world. And so all of these ideas of trying to succeed by stealing things and taking advantage of people always have a consequence for them. It always comes back in one way or another in time, not always right away. So he talks about this human bloodshed and violence done to the end being the reason for this. And that's kind of that same idea of the universe just works that way. When you shed human blood and you do violence like that, the universe has a way of, the universe that God created has a way of getting back at you. And so what's being discussed here is this idea that there's a universal justice standard that must be met. And if you remember earlier, he was talking about the Babylonians had created their own justice system that wasn't based on this universal justice standard that God has built into the universe. He's saying that the Babylonians have defined not only their God that they worship, but they've also defined their own sense of what's right and wrong. And we have the same idea about this universality of consequences for actions. And we have an idiom that we, in fact, two idioms that we use to talk about that. One is what goes around comes around. I don't know if there's a Spanish equivalent to that. But with the English one, it means that the things that you've done just have a habit of coming around. It doesn't take somebody to push it around and make it happen. It just comes around. And people have noticed that because it happens so many times in their experience that you can't succeed in doing evil because there's always some way that comes back to get at you. And we have another idiom that's similar to that. It says we plant the seeds of our own destruction, which means much the same thing. It means that the things that we do end up being the things that, the evil things, of course, that we do, end up being the things that destroy us. And so those two idioms from English express this same universality of justice, that the universe is just built so you can't succeed this way. Now, of course, some people do succeed in getting away with it in their lifetime, and that's what we talked about with the children and the grandchildren. Nonetheless, somebody pays for that ultimately, and it's also the people who, in the afterlife, will pay for it as well. Any questions about that idea?
I want to have a comment, Stan. It seems to me that he holds accountable even people that don't recognize God. They don't really accept him as Israel did back then. It seems like he punishes them just as well, whether they believe in him or not. So I find that interesting, and that kind of goes in line with the universal rules and laws, that apply to everybody.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly true. And remember when God was clearing out Israel for the Israelites to move in, it was called Canaan back then. The same thing happened because of their sins. It was their time to go, and God wanted them out. And so it's a pattern we see all in our own lives, and we see throughout the Bible as well. This idea that you can't get away with these things. Okay, moving on. We're still on this topic of theft and the idea that conquering countries and conquering people is theft. It says, "Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest," which means his house, "on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples. So you are sinning against yourself." Another interesting idea is that stealing is sinning against yourself. And God is going to go into that idea here. And this is this God of strength again for the Chaldeans. For the Israelites, it's believing in being proud of who they are, which is a similar thing. And so God's message here is that you've tried to advance your family, your house, he says, your nest is another way of saying that, and by doing evil to other people. And he's saying that's just not going to work. To save your family from bad things is why you've done this. You've tried to make yourself safe and in fact saved. Salvation, you believe, is coming from these things that you've done. But in fact, what you've done is you've shamed yourself, and you've shamed your whole family. And really, you've sinned against yourself. So he talks about theft now in two different ways. He's talked about theft as being borrowing, as being a loan that must be repaid. And he talks about theft as being a shame to yourself and to your family. And so you've really sinned against yourself by doing these things. And remember, this is a message to Israel also. So how bad things, and he talks about these woes, which is what that means. He says, now, because of what you've done, bad things will fall on your descendants, if not you and your own family. And so this goes back to this theme of there's going to be consequences. This has to be paid for. What you're doing here is wrong, and the world justice will just not stand for that. So continuing on, he says, surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. And so this is continuing on this with this same universal justice idea. And now God has got inanimate objects calling out for justice. So he's saying that a stone will cry out and a rafter of a building will cry out. So these are both things that houses were made of, and he says it will answer it from the framework. So he's talking about building a city, which is what the Chaldeans were doing, on bloodshed and violence. And he's saying that's just not going to work. You can never get away with that. Ultimately, those people that you have done these things to are going to come back at you and get you for what you've done. It just, the world works that way. So we have that idea of that universal justice that applies and is built into everything. And God doesn't need to step in and do these things. These things just happen because God has built the universe this way. So instead, nothing is missed in the accounting of the debt that must be repaid. The things that are done that were wrong must be paid for, and that's just the way it is. You can't get away from that. So anything that's built on evil gain, he says, is destined for justice. It's the things that you've tried to achieve will not be successful, and ultimately you will be destroyed by the people that you've done these things to. So I think this is the last slide on theft, and he goes on to another topic. And he does some odd things here. And he says, is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that people toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? That's an odd phrase. We'll dig into it. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And that's another odd thing. What do you mean by this? This is a strange thing. It doesn't even seem like it belongs in here. So it's God who has set in place the rules that say men who work to build on evil will see it go up in fire and make themselves tired of achieving nothing. So he's saying that the countries who try to achieve things by conquering other countries, and even people who try to steal things from other people, are wasting their time. God has set up the universe so that people who do this are working away for the little things, and they are just making themselves weary and achieving nothing. In the long run, they get nothing out of this. What they've done comes back on them. And we've talked about this idea repeatedly, so I won't go into too much more. But the next verse here, as I mentioned, doesn't even seem to belong here. It seems like it's a topic change. It makes an obvious second coming reference. It's talking about a time when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. We know that as an event in our future. And so it's a prophecy about the future. What's it doing here in this? And so this obvious second coming reference in the world after the second coming is a strange thing to be here. But the message seems to be that God is saying that I've created the universe so that you can't succeed in doing these things. You can't steal stuff and get away from it. It's always going to come back on you. And he's saying, but there's going to be a time when things are not like this. There's going to be a time when the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, and people won't do these things anymore. And they will know better than that. They will know that can't succeed. And he's saying things will not always be this way. There's going to be a time that will come when men will know God and they will not do these evil things. So it's an interesting thing to throw a second coming reference in here just like that. Prophecy does that, though. It's very common for prophets to jump back and forth between times. God doesn't respect time at all. Okay, now he changes topic, and he's going to start talking about drunkenness, but he's not so much talking about physical drunkenness, he's talking about spiritual drunkenness. And that's a common thing also in the Bible, this idea that you can become spiritually drunk. And just as you might stagger around as a physically drunk person, you stagger around spiritually as a spiritually drunk person. And we see that in Revelation and other prophecies. It's a common thing to see there. And in this case, he's going to talk about the Chaldeans making other people drunk. And see, he says, woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom, even to make them drunk so as to look on their nakedness. Nakedness, odd idea. We'll dig into it. He says, you will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. So one thing we see right away there is this same idea that we've been talking about here, is that the things that go around have a way of coming back, and what you've done is going to come back on you. And so this metaphor of wine and drunkenness is used here to indicate that the Chaldeans have used their God of strength, this belief that they are invincible, to confuse their neighboring countries, and they've used that to their advantage with the people that they're about to attack. The people that they're about to attack have heard about them and their power and their ability to conquer other countries, and that's put fear into them, and they are spiritually drunk because of that. And that's what's being talked about here. He's saying you've deceived people with your God of strength, and you've made them spiritually drunk, and they are making bad decisions because of that. And because of that, you are looking on their nakedness. Now, of course, we're not talking physical nakedness here. You're saying that because of you've made them drunk, you're able to look into things and see things and achieve things that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And so that's what's meant by nakedness, not physical nakedness here. So, and he says that you've done this to get a look at what they have and take advantage of them, and to make them weak through their fears. And so the Chaldeans have been using these stories of previous conquests to frighten and weaken other countries. And we actually have an example from the Bible for that. And I'll read this long passage here. This is back in Hezekiah's time. Hezekiah bumps into the Babylonians before they're a conquering country. They're a country at this point in time that is becoming a serious threat, and people in the world are starting to see that they're becoming a powerful country. And the Babylonians send some people to Israel, and Hezekiah gets a chance to meet with them. So that's what this verse or these couple verses from 2 Kings are about. At that time, Berodach Baladan, a son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a gift to Hezekiah because he had heard that Hezekiah had been sick. And Hezekiah listened to them and showed them all his treasure house, the silver, the gold, the balsam oil, the scented oil, the house of his armor, and everything that was found in his treasuries. There was nothing in his house, nor in all his realm, that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet came to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say, and from where have they come to you?" And Hezekiah said, "They have come from far country, Babylon." Isaiah said, "What have they seen in your house?" So Hezekiah answered, "They have seen everything that is in my house. There is nothing among my treasuries that I have not shown them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when everything that is in your house and what your fathers have stored up in this day will be carried to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your sons who will come from you, whom you will father, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon." Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good." For he thought, "Is it not good if there will be peace and security in my days?" So I'll unpack a bunch of this. Hezekiah knew that they were a growing power, and he wanted to show them everything. He wanted to show them all the strength and the wealth of Israel, in the hope that they would not, that they would be dissuaded from attacking Israel. But instead, what he achieved was he showed them all of what the Babylonians could get if they did conquer Israel. And so the Israel also showed them, or Hezekiah actually showed them what their strength was. So the Babylonians also knew how strong they needed to be in order to conquer Israel. So Hezekiah has made a really big mistake here, and God sent Isaiah to speak to him and say, "What a bad thing you've done here. You should have kept these things secret." And so Hezekiah was deceived into doing this because he knew that the Babylonians were becoming a serious threat, and that fear of them caused him to do this. And you see that short-sighted thinking here in his very last sentence. It says, "Is it not good if there will be peace and security in my days?" So Hezekiah is thinking out, what I've done here is going to make things peaceful and secure for all of my time. And whatever problems come are going to come on somebody else's watch, not my watch. Very short-sighted thinking. And so this is the drunkenness that's being talked about here, this spiritual drunkenness that caused Hezekiah to show them everything and give them way too much information about Israel. And that's going to come back on them. Isaiah says, all of this stuff that you've showed them is going to be taken off to Babylon because of what you've done here. But Hezekiah only sees it in short terms. He says, also in those verses, this is going back to the verses from Habakkuk now. "Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness." So here's the same idea. You've come to believe your own stories. You think that you're invincible. And we know that from history that empires come to an end when they become overextended. They believe that there's no limit to what they can achieve, who they can conquer, and they spread out really quickly. The Roman Empire is a really good example of that. They spread out into Britain and it got that far away. And when they get so overextended like that, the country becomes corrupt because of all the wealth that's been brought in because of these conquests, and that corruption doesn't allow the government to be strong enough to maintain all of this conquered territory, and the conquered territory start coming back and conquering the Romans in that case, and conquering those who conquered them. And so again, that's kind of the same idea of you can't achieve success by conquering people, by stealing stuff. And so we know this is true with Babylonians. After Nebuchadnezzar, the following Babylonian kings were incompetent. They were unconcerned about enemy nations around them. They thought that they had achieved what their god of invincibility had promised them, and they couldn't be conquered. But what started happening with the Babylonians is some of the conquered countries started bringing up armies and fighting back against the Babylonians. And ultimately, the Medo-Persians start to see the Babylonians as weak, and they come in and conquer them and wipe out the Babylonians for all time. So there's that same idea of you can't get away with stealing things. And there's also a part of that verse that says, the cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you. And that's that same idea of things that you do have a habit of coming back to you, just as the English idiom says. And so the Bible uses a cup here to indicate events in the future. And so that's something that we see in other prophecies too. Keep that in mind. So, and Jesus used it that way too. He said, I must drink from the cup that's been given to me. And what he means is the events that are set in place for me to do, I must do those things. And the same usage is being used here. It says, the cup in the Lord's right hand is going to come around to you. Those things that you have done are going to come back to you. And so that's with this same, the universe's justice system that God built into it, and that idea of what goes around comes around. So we see a lot of that idea being brought up here in various ways. This one deals with spiritual drunkenness. The other one was theft. But it's all the same idea. The universe just doesn't allow these things to succeed. So the next verse says, for the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town and all its inhabitants. I'll tell you right now, nobody knows what this verse is saying. There's a bunch of people who are taking guesses at it, but they don't agree. And it appears to be referring to some events that happened in Lebanon. History doesn't record anything that the Babylonians did special in Lebanon when they were conquering Lebanon. Remember that Lebanon is just north of Israel, so the Babylonians would have come down through Lebanon into Israel. And so we have no history to give us any guidance on what happens here. And nobody really understands what's being said here. And the idea behind it just seems to be the same as the previous verses, that the things that you've done are going to come back to you. But we don't know the details. We don't understand anything about what really happened there. So now there's another topic change here. God starts talking about idolatry. And he says, what profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image, a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. And now, again, remember that Israel had fallen into idolatry as well. And that, of course, we've talked many times about the Chaldeans and their god of strength that they were worshiping. And so both of these are in focus here. The Chaldeans' god of strength is an idol to them, and the Israelites are into idolatry and fallen away from God. And God says something interesting here, that this speechless idol is able to teach them falsehood. And that's exactly what happens with the Chaldeans and with anybody who's actually into idolatry. The idol that you've created gives you a false sense that is wrong. And so their God of strength has been lying to them about what they can achieve. And their God of strength has effectively been saying, you can conquer the whole world. Don't worry about it. Nobody will ever come back on you. Everything is going to be fine. You can conquer all these things and succeed and make yourself great. That idol is lying to them. So it tells the Chaldeans that they can do all these things, but we've been talking about justice just doesn't allow for that. And it tells them that earthly salvation can be had this way. And so they can save themselves and their families from bad things in the future by conquering other nations. And we know that that just isn't the way the world works. There are many empires that have come and gone. I was talking about the Romans a moment ago. There's no Roman Empire and hasn't been for 1,500 years. And so they paid for the things that they did. And so this universal justice system makes it impossible to achieve these things. And these gods of idolatry that people are worshiping are deceiving them and lying to them and making them think that they can get away with things and do things that they can't, just isn't going to happen. So again, this idea of trusting in things your hands have happened is also a common theme in the Bible. And it's really talking about idolatry, but it isn't necessarily just about physical things. And so the idea that's being stressed in the verse there is, what greatness do you have within yourself that you could create something that would be worthy of trusting in? How are you able to create something that is worthy of your trust? And it's a crazy idea. And so if you could create something that could save you, why wouldn't you just save yourself? Why do you need to create an idol to save you when, if you have the ability to create an idol that could do such a thing, why wouldn't you just save yourself? So that's what God is saying to them about the lunacy that is idolatry. But of course, it's much more subtle than that. We see these same words with other prophets. I mentioned that. But nobody thinks that they are worshiping that block of wood or that stone or whatever it is that they made up as an idol. Those are physical idols, but we also know that there are spiritual idols. Peal of thunder. So a man who is worshiping an idol, like a physical idol made of some metal or wood, he doesn't believe that he's worshiping the wood or the metal. He believes that he's worshiping some god through that object. And so we deceive ourselves into what we're even doing. We don't think that we're worshiping the wood. We think that we're worshiping some god through this. And God says many times that worship just doesn't work that way. You're worshiping a block of wood or stone or whatever it is that this is made of. There is no God behind it. And he even says, remember when we studied the 10 Commandments, he says, don't worship me through these things. I don't want to be worshiped that way. You can't, in fact, worship me that way. It's not acceptable. So God wants worship directly of him, not through anything. And so that's an important thing for us to understand. We know that there are people who struggle with that. So, and I also mentioned, and we'll mention here some more, this idea that idols don't have to be physical things. And the God of strength that the Chaldeans are worshiping is one of those insubstantial things that you can worship. This God of strength isn't something you can carve out. It isn't something you can make out of metals. You can't worship it through it like that, but it's still their God. And so it's an insubstantial God. And in our time, we don't really have idols like that are made of things, physical idols. We have all sorts of other things that we can get into worshiping. I'm not going to go in that direction, but I think you understand that. So with these insubstantial gods, gods you can't make an idol of, you can't make a physical representation of, where there is nothing to bow down to, where there's nothing you could praise them for, it's easy to think that you're not actually into idolatry, that you're not actually worshiping an idol, that and you're not involved in idolatry at all. And so it's easy to become deceived that way. And I know people in Christianity who have started to worship things that they shouldn't. I've talked in the past about pastor worship, and that's a dangerous thing to get into. So I'll just leave it there that idolatry isn't always just blocks of wood or made of physical things. So the verses continue. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. And that is their teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside it. So God is saying, again, look at what you're doing here. This is nonsense. And this one is not just to the Chaldeans. Well, all of them are not just to the Chaldeans, but this is Israel as well, who are doing the exact same thing. And so he's saying, when you call on a God that you've made to save you in a difficult time, the bad things are going to happen anyway, because that God can't do you any good. He says, when bad things come and you say, awake, save me, or when you say, arise, get up there and protect me, that God won't do anything. It can't do anything. And he says, this God that you've made yourself is going to be your teacher. How does that work? How can you make a God that can teach you something you don't already know? And so, again, God is pointing out all the foolishness of idolatry and what you're doing. And as I said, especially in our time, it is such a more subtle thing that we deceive ourselves in thinking that we're doing something that isn't idolatry, but it is. And so But this God of strength that the Chaldeans have also needs to be overlaid in silver and gold. Money keeps that war machine going, and that's how they are succeeding. Their power is coming from their ability to continue financing these operations, these attacks on other countries. And so there is some connection between silver and gold and many of the gods, but not always. It isn't always about money. So, and as I said, and I've said so many times already, God is really speaking to Israel here. And as we know from history, most of Israel has turned away from him. And it's gotten so bad, really, that once God does send in the Babylonians and they destroy Jerusalem, some of the remnant people that we see in Jeremiah still have no idea why they were conquered by the Chaldeans, despite the fact that God had sent prophets all over Israel telling them that he was tired of what they're doing and he wasn't going to take it anymore. And he was sending the Chaldeans in to destroy them. The people after the destruction still have no idea why it happened. And they're still trying to worship these false gods they've been worshiping. So that's how bad it can get. And one last thing here against idolatry, and this is an interesting statement, finishing off this idolatry idea. God has been talking about all these idols who can't do anything. They're speechless. They tell lies. They cannot save you when you're in trouble. And so now what he says here is, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. So the text is contrasting those idols who are useless and can't do anything for you with Yahweh, who is alive and in his temple and able to do things for you. He is the person that you should be trusting in. And this isn't, of course, who the Israelites have been trusting in. It's so much more easier for them to worship gods of silver and stone. So there's that contrast again. And all through this, there's been this dividing line between the Chaldeans and unrighteous Israel against righteous Israel, who will survive all of this. And so God has been pointing out, yes, the Chaldeans are bad, but yeah, you guys are bad too. You're doing all the same things, but just in different ways, and you don't see it. You don't see how evil you've become. And this is the message that I've been talking about that is directed towards those people in Israel who think that they are who are unrighteous, and they see all the unrighteousness around them. But God is saying, you're not all that you think that you are. So summarizing all of this, God has been warning his people, and these people have been represented by the questioner. And we saw from his questions what is his pride and the arrogance that he was displaying in those questions and blaming God and all those sorts of things. And so that questioner has all of these same problems that we've been talking about. That pride, we saw that he thought that he was able to instruct God. He was able to tell God stuff and explain to God why God was wrong. And the people have also been stealing praise and not respecting God and glorifying himself by telling God which way is which. And that drunkenness, that spiritual confusion again, that's also we saw in the questioner. He has these confused ideas about who God is and what God's purpose is and who Israel is and what their purpose is. So this spiritual drunkenness is also seen in the questioner. And that idolatry, we also saw too, he's worshiping himself. He thinks that he is strong and powerful and righteous and doesn't have any flaws. And so he's been worshiping a false god, which is idolatry. So this questioner, which represents all of the unrighteous people of Israel, has all of these problems that God has been talking about and using the Chaldeans as kind of the pattern to show them that they have these problems. So as I've been saying, this message is really for Israel. It isn't for the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are never going to see this message. It's for Israel, and specifically for the people who think that they are righteous in Israel, but they really aren't. They have been confused about what God is to them and their relationship with God, and it's really a mess. And we saw that right from the start when the questioner said, we are more righteous than them being those other countries. And the questioner had this mistaken idea of somehow righteousness was in their nature and they would always be righteous. And but God says, you really aren't that different from the Chaldeans. And what we've just seen here is God going through all of the examples of the evil things that they see in the Chaldeans are really the evil things that are seen in Israel at this point in time. So kind of extending this into a bigger view right now, and then we'll be done. So when does God bring an end to an age? And we talked about those ages before when people came to be so bad that God had to step in a big way and clear things out and keep a remnant and move forward with that remnant. And so what is it that causes God to bring an end to an age like that? And so I ask, when is it when the leaders become corrupt? The leaders of the country are corrupt. Well, that's not really when he does those things. It has to be something bigger than the leaders. That natural justice that comes around affects leaders. So a bad leader tends to end up in a bad way because of the things that he's done. And so that isn't usually when God steps in. And so next you would ask, well, is it when all the people become corrupt? And that's really not it either, although that's certainly closer. That isn't necessarily when God steps in. When God steps in, it's when the once righteous people have become corrupt and they think that they are still righteous. And so that's who the questioner represents. He's representing these people who were once righteous people. They've fallen away. They've come to believe wrong things. And they are now in a situation where they can't be fixed. God is sending them all sorts of prophets to tell them that they're wrong, but they're just not listening to the prophets. And so this is when God brings an end to an age. And that's what's about to happen. 15 years from the time this prophecy was given, the Babylonians come in and wipe out Israel. And we see the same thing in our time. And that's the expansion into our time with this idea is that, and we've talked about this before, this idea that we aren't far from the end. And we see those same things here. We see a church that is becoming corrupt. Yes, that happens throughout history, but now we see it in ways that we just can't even imagine. And so this is kind of the last stage in this thing. This is when things are getting to the point when God says it's about time to bring this to an end. And so in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, I'm sure you remember Paul describes to Timothy what's going to happen in the end times into the church. And he says it's going to be a church that loves money and loves themselves and all those sorts of things. I'm sure you remember that. And so the same idea, Paul talked about that happening, and here it is in our time happening. So this is one of those reasons why we know that things are coming close. We're seeing that. But it's going to become even worse than that yet. Things have to become worse in the ways that the Bible describes before the actual end comes. But this is a sign that we're getting close to that time. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. Any questions?
No, I just have a comment. It seems like that's, I think you're right. This is what it seems like we're coming to a loggerhead, so to speak, that everything is happening all at once, and I'm just kind of wondering when it'll all end. It seems like we're going in that direction right now.
It certainly does, yeah.